Okay, now we're all recording. Thank you. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Amanda Hudson. I am the Education and Research Director with Participatory Budgeting Oregon. You're going to learn all about what participatory budgeting is today, who we are as an organization, and we're going to close with giving you some updates about what's happening, what's been happening in the region, what is happening, what's being worked on, and we're going to end with what you can do about that, how you can get involved, how you can take this knowledge and move with it if you find this an exciting thing to work on. I also want to introduce my co-host, my co-facilitator, Tyler Wilkins.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tyler Wilkins. I am also a co-founder and co-director at Participatory Budgeting Oregon. I oversee most of our advocacy efforts, and so I spend a lot of my time building partnerships with community organizations, community leaders, and local government staff and officials.
Nice. And our roles today is I'm going to present and try my best to talk you through some pretty exciting concepts. And Ty is going to help support me on tech. And so if you guys have anything wonky go on with your, audio or something like that, I'm assuming a lot of you this is not your first Zoom rodeo, but feel free to private message Ty in the chat if you really are having some problem. Also, some great advice I got is 90% of your Zoom problems are solved by exiting and re-entering. So if you need to do that, Ty will let you back in. And we're gonna have, like I mentioned, we're gonna have time for discussion, but feel free if there's like a clarifying question or something that you need me to stop mid-sentence to answer, you can put that in the chat and Ty will do his best to catch that and bring that to my attention. And then later down the road, when we are doing more open discussion, we can use the chat as well for that. So, but in the meantime, let's try and minimize it just so we don't have to try and listen and read at the same time. Today, I'm really excited that you guys are joining us. Participatory budgeting is being talked about in mainstream spaces. We're hearing about it. You might hear politicians saying, yes, let's cut these budgets, or community activists calling for it. It has been on the Movement for Black Lives platform since 2016. So it's a term that you could kind of make a lot of assumptions about, like participatory budgeting. You can have an image in your head. So today we really wanted to just, this is what we do, this is what we're about. So we want to make sure that when people are talking about it, they understand what it is and the true power of doing it and what's happening in the region. We've been working on this stuff for 2 years, and as you can imagine, with the cuts to some police budgets in Portland, things like that, there's some exciting things happening. So we want to share with you what's going on and see what we can do. So thank you for participating in our opening slide. And sometimes I get a little bit of a lag on my stuff. So yes, we're back in. So thanks so much for joining us. And today, our 3 goals. We're going to learn about what PB is. And so just a note, we call it PB because participatory budgeting is a mouthful. So if I'll go back and forth between that, but if I ever say PB, I'm referring to participatory budgeting. And we're going to talk about what it is, how it works. You're going to walk away with kind of an understanding of an overview of the nuts and bolts, if you will. We're going to learn what's happening in the region, and we're going to end with how you guys could support this work if you find it exciting and worthwhile. So you may, like I said, you may have heard about it. The LA's people budget recently, something that made a lot of splash with doing kind of what do people want and how do they shape it, and advocating for participatory budgeting. It's happened all over. You might have heard some newer ones that have been launched in Sacramento or Atlanta. Seattle has been asking to expand it. So you maybe came to this space wondering like, hey, what is it and what's going on in the Portland region? So before we jump into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are. I am Amanda Hudson. I am the Education and Research Director of Participatory Budgeting Oregon. We formed in 2018, actually as a nonprofit. We are fiscally sponsored by the No Agenda Foundation. What happened is we held a large public event, just exploring it as volunteers, and the interest and excitement was really just, we want to see this, we want to see what happens. And so we decided to form as a nonprofit and really just advocate and start asking folks who have control of the budget, like, let's do this. The people really want to see this in a region that's known for participation. We want really tangible tools that give community control. So what our work looks like is we do a lot of training and education. We do popular education style workshops, really trying to model what this is, get people the PB bug, we call it the gateway drug to democracy. So get people really excited about what a traditionally boring and inaccessible concept like budgets can actually have space for like community passion and expertise. We do a lot of advocacy. We show up and we testify at city council meetings, and we work with other community-based leaders and organizations, educating on what this looks like. And we are also practitioners. So our job is, when this gets going, is we really want to make sure that this is a process that lives up to its potential. And so we advocate to make sure, like, look, this is what you need to invest in. Good community outreach and engagement. So also, this is a little bit more about us. I won't read all that. We've done a lot of work as an organization. We have a paid steering committee. We have basically, I think we've calculated it, like not even one full-time staff is split between several of us. We really want to build an organization that's reflective of the kind of radical democracy that we believe in deeply. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out who we are, to not just make sure, to not talk about change out there in the world, but also to make sure our organization is a just and nourishing place. So I can talk about organizational development all day long. That's what we're here for. So before we jump into it, what y'all came in here maybe hearing about it before, maybe you just liked some of the colors and showed up because of that, but my guess is most of you came in probably knowing a lot or having strong impressions about what you think it is. So if you still have your phones out, or if you have them and want to jump in, what do you know? And if you don't feel like you know anything, what do you imagine to be true about participatory budgeting? I'll just let these come through.
For those of you who joined us recently, there's a link on the top of the slide that will take you to polev.com/pborgan240, which will allow you to answer the question you see on your screen and pop up your answers in real time.
Okay, difficult to pursue. There's not enough of it currently taking place. You're preaching to the choir there, yeah. Empowers community members, people powered. Yep, direct influence on the budget decision process. Absolutely.
Wow, we've got a room of PB experts here.
I know. This is my favorite thing about doing these, is I don't have to lecture because the knowledge is already in the room. And I love to hear how people describe it, because it's always like, yes, it is, absolutely. Promising idea. Yeah, I totally agree about the having seen it in practice. It has yet to come to the state of Oregon. So outside of my trips to other places in the country, I haven't seen it on the ground outside of isolated, showing up to different sections of it. So I'm really excited to see the full process and see how we make it to like specific to our local community and context. Often very limited in scope of execution, but definitely some different case studies we could talk about that have people who really get it as a tool for people power, and people who really like how it sounds on paper and then maybe want to not give all that power away. That's the really interesting thing. There's been so many PB processes, so you have quite the range of what it can look like. All right, looks like we hit some saturation there. So just before we even get started, I really like to remind people about this because, some of us are civic nerds and it's obvious, but other people, if you just tell them, like when I explain this to, my uncle, it's like, oh, budgeting, great, like whatever, that's, that's like the eating your broccoli of being a citizen, right? Of being engaged in these things. But I really like to remind people, this came out of a radical movement. So this came in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in a post-dictatorship restructuring. So after that military dictatorship fell, the people got together and were like, how do we design processes of government where something like that never happens again? So how do we have processes that are about community leadership, community, like people powered, really like people know where they live better than anybody. So where do we actually have a process that channels that? And where is it something for accountability and transparency? Because when you see the true brutality of fascism, I'm not going to go on a fascism rant. I'm stopping that right now. But yeah, like really seeing like, how do we design so that never happens again? And that's something I always want to remind. This has very radical roots. And when you get it right, this is the thing about people powered. It came to the US in 2009 in Chicago. It was the first PB process after being in Brazil for about 10 years or so, and it spread to different parts of Central and South America and eventually came to the US. And it's been all over the US since then. The largest process you may have heard of is New York, and they're the ones who have like the largest dollar amounts and kind of the most engagement. And it came to the Northwest in 2016, Seattle, which was actually a citywide youth-based process. And it's been a little bit in the Northwest and yet to come to Oregon, which one of my colleagues always loves to say, we have a lot to learn as being late adopters. We have 30 years of case studies and kind of this proven track record. So we actually have a lot of ammo to get this right. So what is it? We often find ourselves explaining to people, actually, no, it's not that. So just so you have the definition, participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which community members decide to spend a portion of a public budget. So it's not the whole thing. It's not maybe some of these processes where you see people like, oh, do a simulator where you say how much you want to spend on streets. So, or like an input or advisory thing. This is actually a binding decision that's made with an identified amount of money. So when everybody starts the process, you know exactly how much money has been set aside. So it's not gathering ideas to maybe do something with it later. It's clearly understood what you're spending. So say $1 million. And then it's a binding vote at the end. So the first stage, what we think is really crucial as well, it's not just getting people involved in building these projects, it's actually getting people involved in the rulemaking. The first phase is a community-based representative steering committee. This is really that phase where you can get it right. If you do the engagement right, get the people at the table who haven't been showing up at City Hall, and they design a rule book. This is an actual document that is publicly available. So I love to think about the idea. I wish all public processes had a really clear, accessible rule book so I can know how to hold people accountable to doing what they say they're doing. And this gets down to these, and this is why it's a community design process. Who do you want to vote in this? What kind of credentials do they need to vote? Do you need an ID? Do you need maybe people just to sign an affidavit? What about places like in Portland region that have had high levels of displacement? What if somebody has a identity with that space but no longer lives in a certain municipal boundary? So these are the kind of locally specific things that a community-based steering committee grapples with and defines it. Who can vote? What kind of projects there are, what are the values and goals of that process, and then they turn that over to stage 2, where it becomes this is the publicly facing part of the process, where it looks probably similar to a lot of public involvement things you guys might have gone to. You'd probably go into an event with some flip chart paper on a wall and sticky notes, and the main questions here is a brainstorming session. It's a crowdsourcing. What do you like about your community? What do we get right here? And what do you want to change? Raw ideas, they don't need to be advanced solutions or people coming in with fully developed, proposals. It's, we have a lot of trees and I like how many street trees we have here. Or we have terrible bus connections in the part of town I'm in, and our service cuts off after this point. So really it can be about your very specific localized knowledge. What then it goes into stage 3, which is this project development phase. Once again, this is what makes PB dramatically different. People who showed up to that, so say you guys all joined me at that brainstorming session, and I would actually be like, hey, do you want to volunteer and get involved and take these ideas and develop them into real implementable projects? In that phase, folks then will take all those ideas, sort them, turn into committees. So you can have your education committee, your streets committee, your parks committee, and then they work with staff. And this is the part where people whose job it is to put in that park bench or to plan that mural, the community members work with them to see what's feasible, what is possible with what the city owns or what they don't, kind of that civic education on all the layers of government that are usually quite confusing. So you work with a professional, and the idea is that they tell you what's possible, they're not telling you what you should do. And that you develop multiple projects, they go on a ballot. So that's down to this binding vote part in stage 4. And then it's back to a big community process of, you can do this online, in person, combination of both. The really fun ones, it looks like a science fair where you go station to station and people have, you know, poster board of like, here, let's put lights on this street. Let's put, you know, new air conditioning in this school. Like it's very specific. You get to talk to the people who develop the proposals. You then vote, and it's not winner takes all. You vote until you run out of money. So multiple projects get funded, and the ones with the most votes win. And then they get implemented, which is my favorite thing to point out, that it's not great, the community wants this, and then you never know what actually happens with it. You never hear what the city or the county did with all of that input and all that passion you put into it. But it's actually implemented, and then the cycle repeats. This goes alongside the conventional budgeting process. So a lot of information. I'm not going to test you on it, but let's try this. Let's just see if this works in theory. So this is where we get to go back to our polling software. And so imagine at this point, there was a community-based steering committee. We all show up to this big event. We're in stage 2 brainstorming, and maybe we read about it and we heard about it in the email. We're all going to show up and say, what do we like about our community? Where do you like about where you live? What are they doing right? And this would look like sticky notes. We did this form of voting where you can up and down because you could, you know, add little dots to agree what people said. So it's a collaborative way of sharing and brainstorming. Lots of trees. Yummy food. Nice. Yeah, we are trying to address our history of systemic and institutionalized racism. I might have read into that with the past harms, but I feel pretty safe in saying that statement. Nice. And right now, we're trying to have this emulate. Here's what that kind of vetting would look like. Ideas are shared. You can have multiple people sharing the same ideas, start sorting, and you'll start to see that, you know, everybody has similar and overlapping and sometimes contradicting experiences on how they see it. And then you can see there's more down here. Sidewalks, food. So then the next one, what would you want to change or improve about where you live? So what is going poorly, or what can just be built upon? What's a success that maybe needs more investment? That's another way to think about it. Safer streets, yeah. Nice. So then we would go, you get those, and this is often where I say how conventional civic or community engagement would stop there, right? Thanks everybody, bye. So this is the next phase, project development. So imagine I got all you guys to volunteer to be, the term is used, budget delegates, and that your job now is to take all those raw ideas that everybody shared, and you're gonna turn this into a feasible working proposal, project proposal. This is usually the longer term thing. It can take 3 to 6 months, happen over multiple meetings, site visits or something. It's key when you're talking about equity, really get people out there grappling with what does the need look like? How is this benefiting the most people? What's the history of investment in these places? Really, you have to be out there and see what it looks like. I'm going to show you a set. This is the first. I'm going to show you 6 proposals. And so in our experiment here, if you pay attention to the pictures, you're going to get a chance to vote on this. Why I really like these is these are real projects that won in other PV processes in North America. So I pull them mostly. So example in this one, let's imagine that I'm going to give you guys $100,000 to vote on all these with. They really have a range. So the idea is that you're voting on things that are not necessarily comparable. It's not just like all streets. It can be, depending on how the money works, sometimes money can be really flexible or other times it's very designated. So, but these are the different variety of things. So an employment program, improvements to a youth homeless shelter, ESL classes for immigrants and refugees, homeless critical resource kits. I'll let you read those and we'll just see. Then we have new water fountains, safe routes to school. So all of these had won in their various PB processes. So in our mock PB process right now that we're testing out, we're gonna know what the vote would look like. Same thing, go back to a public event, where everybody shows up, you can vote online in most cases. So you show up and you vote how you would vote in just what are the ones you like. And this one you get 2 votes. Usually you get to vote in all the processes, you get to vote for multiple things. Thanks. So in this mock PV process, oh, homeless resource kits is coming up, oh, or not. So in our process, clearly safe routes to school would win. Actually, let me move my screens around so I'm not covering up. And then our improvements for the youth homeless shelters would win. And just the dollar amounts, if you have anything left, it would go to the next one. And another note too, is that folks, when their ballot initiative, when they don't pass, oftentimes they can show up on the next year. And it ends up being this kind of civic engagement thing, like you would expect people to be demoralized. And of course, I'm sure that happens, but overwhelmingly the majority of people will show up multiple years and build relationships and redevelop projects. Another example that's really exciting is that historically, PB has been this space that is just this great mechanism for communicating with electeds. So sometimes it will bring up things that electeds just had no idea were happening. An example in, I want to say in Phoenix, there were no bathroom doors in this bathroom. And so the project came up really quick of like, let's put bathroom doors on. And this was a school district based one. And they were like, wait, what? There's no bathroom doors? And so they're like, don't put that on the ballot. We'll just fix that. And there's tons of examples of that, of it just being this mechanism to communicate that doesn't come out in a conventional giving testimony or the kind of very rigid, static ways that we have of participating in our current system. So, what are the benefits? The thing that I find most exciting about this is that it's heavily researched, and the research is quite encouraging. It's because it has been around for 30 years and many a dissertation has been published on it. And that's how I actually encountered it as a kind of an academic thing. We're really confident that this brings just a net positive benefit to the community. So thinking today that we're really thinking about equity and inclusion and creating more just public budgets, I really just want to focus on 2 ideas: that PB leads to broader participation and it leads to equity and investment. We'll talk about that just a sec. So over and over again, the research shows that people who participate in PB, and particularly in the US context, we have a great track record of folks who don't normally show up. So 50% of people who had worked on this one PB cycle had never been involved in a community-based issue. A third of the participants were foreign-born, and 23% of people had barriers to voting in conventional elections. And that's the obvious ways of maybe they don't have full citizenship where they can't, vote in a conventional election, but also things like age. In PB, every PB process that's happened in the US has allowed for participation from people under the age of 18, sometimes as low as 11 years old. I think the average age is like 14 for the bottom end. So what does this look like when you have, youth able to make real, meaningful, impactful decisions about the community they live in, not just kind of in this holding pattern of being expected to be responsible with no real civic power. So that's one of our favorite things to think and talk about is school-based PB and youth involvement in PB. Like, what better way to teach civics, right? The other thing is one of the more emerging types of research is, does this now lead to broader participation in conventional elections? And one study found that people who participated in PB were 7% more likely to vote now. So it's this idea of like a really engaged, meaningful civic education that leads to increased trust and transparency. There's tons of anecdotes of, then I went on to serve on this person's campaign, or I sat on that committee where they never would have done that before. And it really does have a great track record of bringing in people who are not the usual suspects. And then thinking about equity investment, the research is very strong on this in the places where PB has been the longest. So in Brazil and South America, this is really shown to increase, like city sanitation and street paving, things that are really like bringing up the quality of the infrastructure in places where poor folks have lived or had just been ignored and excluded from the conventional budgeting process. So there's really strong research there. In the US, PB has been kind of an activist movement. It's been brought by people who are really have their eyes set on a reinvigoration and a redesigning of democracy in the US. As we like to say, it's really about making the democracy promises in the US live up to maybe what our founders never really intentionally meant them to be, but really like, hey, you say participation for all, let's do it. So the broader global PB community is really about like wanting a new system, wanting something like opening the doors of government wide and getting people, shining the light on all those cracks of bureaucracy and really getting people involved in their governance of their communities. And I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't tell you some of the problems, some of the things that we need to watch out for, because if we are going to do this in Oregon, we need to learn from the challenges as well. So I want to right off the bat, broader participation does not equal equitable investment. So that means just because you have folks who don't normally show up to City Hall participating doesn't mean that projects are now going to be funded in areas that haven't been historically invested in. That has to be designed, and you're going to hear this throughout. Explicit power analysis has to be embedded. So equity, I mean, we have no shortage of places that talk about how they care about equity and no results, right? And we're really grappling that right now, widespread as a community in all these spaces. So if we want to really take equity seriously, you have to put resources behind it. You have to not just have the conversation at the beginning, it has to come throughout, and it has to be, you have to have actual mechanisms to make sure. So accountability too, like we can plan all day long, but until we actually hold ourselves accountable to really measure and implement equitable things, it's not going to happen by itself. And that's my last point really, is that folks talk about it, they grapple with it, but then it's something they never revisit, and you kind of just go back to like, okay, let's put in that curb bump out, not necessarily having like an equity score, really making sure that it is something that does benefit folks who have been historically excluded. And so before I go there, just to give a little physical interaction right now, I just gave you so much information. So if you'd humor me, those of you with your cameras on, and if anybody wants to pop on their camera, how are you feeling about that right now? So just a thumbs up, like, okay, I get it, or I have no idea, or I don't know what you're talking about. Just a little. Oh, I like the manual. Thank you for that. Nice, nice. Yeah, I see some middles. Yeah, Ty cheating with the devil. Thank you. Thank you. That's always helpful. Especially, it's always great in a presentation, just be the one voice, and Zoom amplifies that so much. So The next is, I'm going to challenge you for one word. What's your one word reaction to this right now? How it looks like for you and your community and your work, and however, what's the word jumping out at you right now after all that? Nice. Wowzers, I like that. Hesitant, fair, absolutely. Hopeful, interested, new. Nice. Nice. All right. 1 second. All right. Thank you for sharing your reactions. I always want to try and give a little space to let our brains process. Okay. There we go. Now what's happening in the region? Hopefully maybe that's why some of you showed up today to want to know, wait, why aren't we doing this? Or what have we been doing? So that's where we come in as your Oregon-based participatory budgeting agitators. So the very first time there's kind of anything on record of it being discussed meaningfully in our region is then candidate Wheeler had answered in debate that he wanted to see New York style participatory budgeting come to the region. From there, one of the kind of subsequent traction that there was an attempt to do it with the marijuana tax revenue. That was actually, this is about when our group of then volunteers got involved and strongly discouraged that because of the limitations on that money. And this is kind of something that might make sense to the participatory involvement folks. When there's a source of money where all decisions are really made and it's really restricted, that's not really a great space to have people come and dream and then you say, no, can't do that, can't do that. So we took some of that money and we held a community forum out of the Rosewood Initiative in 2018 and had over 100 community leaders, elected officials, and their staff come. They learned from international experts, scholars, other elected officials that implemented, youth who'd been involved in different regions, and really learn, okay, what does this look like? What could this be in the region? And what are the priorities you want to see? People overwhelmingly were interested in it. If you're interested in learning more about that, we do have a forum, a report we published if you want to learn more what people said in those spaces. And then we decided to form as like, there's a lot here, let's do this. We're all a bunch of civic nerds. And so we're like, absolutely, let's go for this. One of our early successes was having the Metro Parks and Nature Bond include funds for participatory budgeting within the participatory grant making, nature and neighborhoods. I might be saying that wrong. Feel free to correct me if I mentioned the wrong program, but it's definitely under the participatory grant making program. And then one of the recent ones is the Portland Police Bureau disinvestment, where $1 million of the cuts, $1 million was set aside to do houseless PB. Participatory budgeting was included as a recommendation in the Metro Get Moving measure, and particularly within the anti-displacement programs. Currently, Gresham is considering using PB to allocate the local share from that's Parks and Nature Bond. And we're excited as well that we've been talking with local foundations, really trying to there's this history of local foundations catalyzing an investment into participatory budgeting. So the Oregon Community Foundation has issued a request for proposals to try and launch PB with community-based organizations and municipal governments. And that puts us to our win. We're on the cusp of this. We want to see it happen. When, just the question is when. And just to give you another way of looking at that, people who put money on the table are Portland and Metro. Active kind of advocacy campaigns are the city of Gresham and Reynolds School District. We're developing a proposal with the Education Association to use Student Success Act's fund to do district-wide PB. And then we have been all over this community for the last 2 years, doing trainings, reaching out, lots of meetings, so many meetings. And so the people who we are like, you know what PB is because we've talked to you about it, in Multnomah County, City of Milwaukee, Gresham Barlow, City of Tigard, and Clackamas County. Okay, so speaking of these elected officials, Mario Palmero has joined us. He's a Gresham City Councilor, and he's just going to talk with us a little bit about the work that's going on in Gresham, but really like him as an elected official, how does he see this tool? How does it fit with his kind of ideology of governance? So thank you for joining us, Mario.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. You know, the word I thought about, Amanda, was power. That's what I think of participatory budgeting. PB is power, because it kind of gives people that voice that they haven't been given before in the past. I think it would fit very well in our city government, in Gresham, for example. In Gresham, we have what they call at-large elections. So we don't have districts where, you know, I represent this district, this person represents that district. It's at large. So what that means is that you can come and run for office and live in the same neighborhood as the other 5 city councilors, and there's no one representing certain parts of the city. And I think that's kind of influenced much of where the resources went. So I live, for example, in Centennial, right next to Rockwood and right next to Brooks East. And we have, what we've seen now is just generation after generation of just people ignoring us, governments ignoring us, resources going other places. And I think the best way to combat that, to correct that, is PB. It allows people voice, allows people participation. We're looking at it in terms of trying to fund our parks. But, you know, there's always resistance. People don't want to change. People don't want to lose control of what they've held for so long. But if it's not doing anyone any justice, if it's not improving the quality of lives of people, we have to do something different. And that's why I'm supporting this effort. I think that we have approved a what they call the word they use, where they're going to research the area to see a feasibility study. Excuse me, feasibility study. That's what we approved. So we'll see how this turns out. I'm hoping that other cities in our area, in East County, can jump aboard and be a part of it. But I think, regardless of that, I think Gresham needs to move forward on it. Like I said, it's something that needs to be taken seriously, and that, you know, we need to start building trust between communities and government. I think it's really, really showing nowadays that it's lacking. So we need to start building that trust again. And it's a perfect vehicle for that. Trust, for change, for more equity in distribution of resources. So it's something that I believe very strongly about. So I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to ask or jump in, or.
We will do some questions. So if anybody does want to think on a question for Mario as well, and we'll just do general after this. But Mario, I'm curious on what would be your advice from your vantage point of how people can, if they get the bug, they want to see this happen, like what's kind of the, you know, residents' approach to try and influence and make this happen?
See, the interesting thing is it's the residents that have all the power. Once they figure that out, once they know that their voice does matter, that if they come together and they go to a next city, I'm gonna find out exactly when our next meeting is regarding our parks districts. And if they can come to that meeting and just show their support for PB, that will go a long way. It is so important that people show up. And I understand it can be intimidating and it's not some of the funnest places to be, City Hall. However, the community needs it. I mean, there's parts of my community that do not have sidewalks, that don't have, you know, safe routes to school. And then you look at other parts of our city, they have everything they need. So we need to make some changes. So please get in contact with your local officials, find out what you can do and when these meetings are so you can participate. Once again, some messages. I think it's October 20th. Yes, October 20th, yes, 10 a.m. Thank you so much.
I had a feeling somebody in this group would know when. Nice. And then why do you particularly, you kind of touched on this, but why do you think Gresham is a place that this would work in? Like why, like what's your kind of vision? I mean, I know we're talking about it in this the parks, but what if you could just have your blank check on making it happen? What would you want PB to do in your community?
Oh man, start correcting the mistakes of the past. I mean, we're still living through these mistakes. We live in a food desert. parts of Gresham do not have a grocery store where they can offer fresh foods and vegetables for citizens. I mean, we need to start changing that. And I think many times us as elected officials and bureaucrats believe that we have all the answers, and we don't. Many times we need to listen to the public. They have the answer. They may have an answer that to something that has, you know, made it difficult for us to solve, and they can just come in and just give us a different perspective that we really didn't think about. And that is something I think is lacking in politics today, is that opinion from the public.
Nice, thanks for that. And that kind of, I just have one more. This is the what can you guys do? And I'll have questions too. So I see some, I'm not checking the chat to not make my head spin, but we'll have some chance to go through this and Ty will assist me. So if you have any questions for me, Mario, even randomly polling our group of people, I'm sure we have lots of experts in this room. So what can you do? I have to make the plug right off the bat. Support our work. We are your local, there is no Oregon-based group doing this. We are connected to the international and national community of people really learning and just seeing, here's all the great research, but really what does Oregon, what is the Portland region, what is our unique history? And I will right off the bat talk about us as an organization. We take very seriously, we think that we need to be rooted and centered on racial equity. With Oregon's history as a white supremacist state, that we cannot build another participatory process that does not put that front and center, because if we keep designing the same process, the same people are going to show up and we're going to keep reproducing the same unjust and inequitable outcomes. And that's why we really get excited about PB as not just a way to talk about equity, but a way to operationalize it. So what that looks like for us is showing up and putting pressure on elected officials and saying, what about this pot of money? What about that pot of money? And also working with community-based organizations. We work with East County Rising. We've done lots of trainings with Unite Oregon. What we want to do is put the folks who put racial equity at the center and who are working with frontline communities, we want to show up and support them. And if they're into PB, we want to say, okay, how do we help you make this, work with your communities? So that's the places that we like to show up for and support. Also contact your elected officials. As Maria said, like, residents really do have the power. We've just, for some reason, we've got the message that our voices don't matter, and we need to stop letting that internalized nonsense go on, and talk with PB about PB with community leaders. If you're in a community-based organization, if you're in local government as a bureaucrat, we do offer trainings. We do in person. We've done some great park-based trainings to do some open air social distance stuff. We do these in-person webinar kind of different things. So we want to offer our trainings particularly for Black and Brown communities, for, like low-income communities, people who are really trying to get power to people who have been ignored, excluded, and overlooked in our system. And that's my final plug there. So questions, and this is where Ty is going to help me out and be my MC on pointing out any questions that are, I see 14 chats in here. So.
Yeah, I think the first question that we had pop up is from, sorry if I'm pronouncing wrong, Elisa. And it is a question for Mario, and asking, how do you address staff plans that are already in place using the money?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
It's how do you address?
Can I ask the question?
Oh yeah, please do.
So I was wondering about, I really love our city staff, but they already have like all this planning spent out for years for like the transportation system plan and a priority of where sidewalks go in and things like that. How can, it seems like that you have to like take money away from the staff almost to be able, for the community to be able to be part of that.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if we would have to take money out of already pre-existing earmarked projects, but I think what I would suggest we do is that we look at every project through a PB focal. Like, we would look at it in terms of, is this what the community wants? Is this what the community is saying that they need? And look at it through that focal point instead of us dictating to the community what they need. I don't know if that makes any sense, but essentially it's just we would look at every project and then look at it through a PB point of view.
Yeah, I would agree with that generally is we often say PB does not need a new pot of money. It's just a different way to spend current pots of money and the scale of it. So even in kind of predefined, like we're going to build a park, there's still so many decisions where the design and expertise of the community really like that user focus, not just like everybody who has a stake in it, but people who are around it. And so, I mean, that's why I was trying to in the examples of the projects, like they're at a scale where so many people can be involved in dictating like what it actually tactily looks like. So it doesn't have to necessarily change big agendas. It's just a way to engage the community meaningfully in these bigger plans.
And then we've got a question from Margaret, which I think is a really important question. And she's asking about how is the steering committee selected and where does equity built into that process?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that's a great question. The steering committee is going to vary. Like I kind of give you a standard. I know the places that have done it right, so I'll just speak to that. But so this can vary. It's usually there's this kind of planning phase we're in, this advocacy phase. So it's folks in this. Hey, where is it going to happen with what pot of money? Who are the elected officials who are going to champion this? Who are the community-based organizations who see this as something they want to work towards and advocate for? So it's oftentimes folks who kind of get contacted and alerted during that time. So I would just, when there's a specific focus to it, so there's been like, there's the kind of obvious, if it's a parks one, you would be like looking at the organizations, maybe you could be there as a community member or an actual representative from a community-based organization who works on that content matter. My recommendation would be to do a mix. There's oftentimes where people can appoint some, like, oh, we need the person from these obvious candidates, and then an application process to make sure it's representative. The differences are going to come up too is it citywide? Is it a process that's focused on districts? Is it a population specific one, for example, and the one that's coming with nothing really defined right now with a houseless population? So there's kind of some of that intuitive, and then there will be a recruitment. And really their first phase is to define the goals of the process. So that's really where equity can come up, where it's like, okay, what does that look like? And there's some examples of like equity scores being assigned. So like, how do you actually start to operationalize? Like this needs to impact these communities, Black and Brown communities who have been, subject to like housing discrimination. So that's really, it's through a facilitated conversation of how that equity conversation starts to get defined and meaningful rules that govern the engagement of the process.
So now I'm looking at, I think one of my favorite questions, or maybe even my favorite thing, PB processes is, I have Noel asking for examples of children and youth participation or leadership in PB, which I might just answer that since it is one of my favorite things. I think the most exciting and probably best example of that is there's a school district in Phoenix, Arizona, who participates in participatory budgeting. It's a 7-school district, and they each get, I think, $7,000. Each school gets $7,000 to spend. And the process has been going on for a few cycles now. And we can provide some information too on what that process looks like. But one of the reasons we think that youth participatory budgeting is so exciting is that they are often one of the most overlooked populations, and youth are such sharp and intelligent and really aware of just the environment that they participate in and live in, but they often don't have any avenues to access or exercise that power or that prowess. So PB really gives an opportunity for them to build their civic capacity. And we kind of talk about this civic pipeline of really gearing up youth to be civically active and engaged so they can start early and they can practice and participate and really kind of ramp up into a more participative kind of communities that they enter into. So Phoenix is a really good example. New York also does youth-based PB, and they do school-based, where schools get to decide on how to spend a portion of the school budget. So it's similar to how city PB looks like, or municipality-based PB, although it's either isolated in schools or in like a youth demographic of a district or something like that. So I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
I always have something to add, right? I would say just one of my favorite shiny examples. My favorite example right now is there's two Brooklyn school-based PB processes. They together they were $1 million. So significantly the largest school-based PB that has happened to date. Each campus got to spend 500,000. What made this one really exciting is that while they did the conventional project development where people were voting on, you know, clear projects that had dollar amounts to it, they had one larger policy question that they got to define. And that was part of what made the project so big. So the question was, how did they want to see public safety addressed? What kind of investments did they want to see for public safety on their campus? And this is my favorite part because it's like, everybody knows they didn't want more cops on their campus. Like it's like, of course, but the administration was like, wow, we were really surprised. They didn't want more public safety officers. They wanted clubs. They wanted after school programming. They saw safety as having, you know, not enough social connections, which is like, and this is before really the, you know, the movement that we're in was so front and center. And it's like, yes, we've had these answers. You know, people who are closest to these things are the absolute experts on it. And one of my favorite ideas about youth engagement is that youth are going to be impacted by the decisions we make today longer than just about anybody, just because of a sheer numbers game. Longitudinally, the decisions we make today will affect them for the majority of their life. So we need to build real structures to get their input and not just wait. And I'm like, well, it's weird. Young people don't vote. It's like, yeah, because they've been infantilized. So let's trust in their, you know, the kind of humans we're investing in them to become and give them real power to say what they want their community and their schools to look like.
Great, and I might actually even just keep this conversation going, and folks in the room might not have any knowledge on specific PB processes that focus on youth, but I am curious if there's any kind of youth leaders, youth advocates, youth organizers, folks who are directly involved with youth. I mean, we're all, I guess, inadvertently connected to youth, but that might want to speak on their perspective on the power they could see in a youth or a student-based PB process. If anybody has any ideas or perspective that they'd want to share, feel free to jump in. If not, we can go to our next question.
The Youth Advisory Council to our mayor was given the task, or every year they've been getting better and better. And last year they were given the task of like, what project do they want to take on? And they actually ended up adopting a plastic bag ban that went all the way to the state level. But it was kind of like, how much resources can they be given? They were given staff resources, they were given education components, but it made a huge impact. And they went out and polled the community and everything, but it went all the way to the state level, to the state plastic bag ban at the state level came from our youth advisory committee in Hillsborough.
That's awesome. That's very exciting. And that's one other note we always like to share. The research is really powerful when you couple youth PB with civics education. So this is not uniform, and I know the Oregon kind of education department standards can be implemented differently, but everybody at one point has kind of a what is government, and when you see youth having these big outcomes where they're reporting, I feel so much more powerful, I feel so much more knowledgeable, you see those big gains when it's coupled with their curriculum. So giving youth a real world engaged, you know, PB opportunity alongside their kind of, you know, boring, dry curriculum, maybe I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, it ends up being something that transforms their civics education.
Cool. Anybody else have any last minute perspective they want to add? All right, we're going to move to, Bill has a really great comment and question, and I think is one that's really important that we talk about, and one that really requires us to really put pressure onto the participating stakeholders in a process to really ensure that this is an equitable and meaningful and valuable process. To summarize, Bill is talking about that many government already know and understand what BIPOC and marginalized communities need and refuse to address those authentically, and looking at, you know, the potential of a PB process kind of being galvanized in a way that is offered kind of like scraps and is almost a way to divert of like, oh, look, we've done this process. We've reached our equity goals, and then continue to really divest or really not make big investments into the places that are really essential. So can you speak, Amanda, at all on, you know, how we can ensure that that doesn't happen outside of just putting pressure on and Bill, I'm sorry, feel free to also chip in if you don't feel like that accurately represents your question, but your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm smiling a bit because I know Ty knows this is the kind of question I love. This is something we talk so much. Yeah, tokenizing. Like I have, that's my pet peeve in general with public involvement, right? Like, oh, we heard from the community. It's like, no, it was advisory, and you did whatever you wanted anyway. So sometimes it can be just a really blatant box checking. My favorite thing about PB is that the design itself makes that a lot harder because people are built in from the rule design with the steering committee to idea collection and implementation. The work that we do on the planning and advocacy end is getting that money identified. So ways that we think it's incredibly important to make sure that it's not something that gets hijacked by maybe the usual suspects. It's a huge concern. I know it's like directly addressing your question, but something that comes up like, how do we know it's not just be another mechanism for the, you know, people who always show up and get their way to just have more resources? Or how do we, like, why don't we just listen to people? Why do we have to go through this process to get access to public money? So how do you make sure it's not hijacked we would strongly, for starting off, we say, don't do something downtown, don't do something even citywide, like particularly in somewhere like Portland, and Mario mentioned the at-large, something that doesn't have like districts. When we already know our current systems are inequitable in representation, doing something just on top of the gaping issues of the current system, just throwing PB on, back to my idea of like equity, like it's not going to magically fix it. It needs to be invested in, it needs to be prioritized. And more than anything, the steering committee and just engagement, it has to be real power. So you have to have electeds get out of the way and make commitments, having that in writing, having like this money is there, and when this vote is binding, having that be, and really making sure that the community-based steering committee has power in processes that we've seen start off strong and then kind of get a little watered down is when that committee transitions to be more advisory, where they're like, this is not what we want, this is not what we need in our communities, and where it starts to be more of a, sure, thanks, we've heard your comments, moving on. So really investing power in that community-based steering committee to design accordingly. Just being right up front with it, like when you do have the design coming from these folks, then it needs to be like, listen to what they say. This is like a particular, I'm from Portland, so I'll say this is a Portland issue of, we know what to do. We like exactly that. The BIPOC community has written so many plans, like House People's Plan is beautiful, and there's no shortage. We know it's doing it, implementing it, not just talking about what to do, actually doing it. And so really what that means is getting out of the way and taking leadership from the communities who are most affected by these issues that are like the cancer inside our societies right now. So that's a little theoretical, but it's also about giving up power and writing it down and holding people accountable. And then the other of just investing of why making people go through kind of this process. I love to see PB brings people into spaces of government that are not accessible. And it really gets to be this kind of vehicle. And this is where the potential of PB is exhilarating, because if the government agency who's enacting this is open and really wants to have an authentic, you know, improved relationship with their community members, then they should have a two-way communication. So examples start to come up where people say, well, why is our vendor list so restrictive? And why does that cost so much? Why is this, you know, bidding, like where people can actually see like some of these ins and outs of government processes. And if those, so some of these examples from like the Phoenix school-based PB, they talk a lot about how it's changed their district level policies because of the student impact. So that's that space where if you can build this real relationship and you have people who are like taking this seriously, the potential of what it can open up to transform not just better outcomes, but better processes is really unlimited. And it's getting that representation from the community steering committee right, giving power to the people who are involved in that, and investing in real equity-centered community engagement, because we know who shows up. It's people who have the least barriers. So designing a process that's centered on people who have, historic, well-earned distrust of government or just limitations to getting to spaces. So that looks like childcare and transit passes and all the kind of just good community engagement principles that and we say, we don't apologize for PB costs money, because you need to invest. You're building a long-term civic engagement infrastructure, because we know who shows up. And if you're going to keep doing this, like, we can't pretend like, it's so weird, we just had all these same affluent folks show up. And you have to build a different system.
I wish Zoom added Snap to the actions list.
I like it.
And so I have a question from Manuel. It might be a quick question, because I don't believe we do, but Manuel is asking if there's any connection or relationship between the PB community with the lottery-based participatory government community, which I am not aware of.
Yeah, I would say lightly in the academic, and this gets in, it's actually one of my personal things as an academic, where they kind of get listed together. So if I'm thinking or referencing like sortition and citizens juries and things like that use the kind of demographically representative selection. PB does not do that, because it's very about experience, and it's not necessarily trying to make a demographically representative thing, but the principles of deliberative and participatory democracy, they come from the same kind of political science worlds. And the people are like generally in like, oh yeah, you guys do that citizens jury stuff, we do this PB stuff. But that, I personally think they need to be more interwoven, because my dream is to have a alternate platform of community-led governance options to be like, oh, we have a better way of doing that policy process. So, but yeah, they're limited and much more theoretically and academically connected than in real world.
Thanks for that. So we've got a couple more questions, and then we might be able to break a little bit early. So we've got Amanda, who is asking, Amanda, are there examples of governments that have committed to dedicate a certain % of their overall budget to PB each year?
Absolutely. So oftentimes you'll hear it as a dollar amount. The recommendation of, there's some in like Brazil that did 100% of their budget, participatory budgeting, which is like, wow, that's awesome. In general, like the national organization, who is kind of like the train the trainer types, who are really interested in like just making sure there's good PB across the board and how they can catalyze it, they say 5% of a budget would be like gigantic and kind of the top end of, because really it's just one thing of PB is great, but nobody who's into PB is like, this will solve every problem in the world. So it's really about like getting into certain parts and shining light on these parts of government. So Paris, I'm pretty sure, is maybe the largest dollar amount or euro amount. And it's something like, it's really big. It's something like 5 million euro. And that one's closer to the 5%. Oftentimes we say, like, we would recommend with the government when we start saying, you should do 1% of your budget. But oftentimes it's more about dollar amounts. So I'd say in New York, for example, each district participates and they have to commit at least $1 million to do it. So each district has a process between $1 and $2 million. And then our general recommendation is anything below 500,000 of the money to spend is kind of the bottom end, because as you could imagine, in a participatory intensive process, it's going to take about the same amount of investment in the process to spend $10 as it will 10 million. If you want to outreach, if you want to get folks in, interpretation, translation, childcare, all these things that we know you need to have really equitable and representative processes, that costs what it costs regardless of how much money you're spending together.
All right, we've got another question from, well, not another question, but a question from Olivia asking, is the PB model at all applicable to getting community input and the reallocation of funds?
So the overall, that's the general, how do we influence the large amounts of budgeting? This is one of these that is going to vary dramatically. Something we like to talk about in PB is it can build on the goals of your governing process. So sometimes example of two processes I was up close to. One was about connecting community members across the board. So they designed that process to just really bring people together. Another one was about really, so an example in Phoenix was about turning out larger voter engagement. So they designed their entire process around registering voters. It was a youth-centered one, so registering voters who would be 18 in time for the election. They really wanted to make voting feel accessible, so the county recorder let them do PB on the voting machines in Arizona. Really, so that was the goal and focus. So the process looked different because of their priorities. So an example in Greensboro, they wanted to get to more of a how do people share their overall values on what the big budget should look like. So they created an online budget simulator of here's what the current budget looks like. And I'm pretty sure if you Google it, you can still access that and play with that. And that's like, here's all the revenue and here's all of your things. What happens when you cut this and how do you balance this? So that, because that was their priority, they invested in design to make their process look like that. So once again, this is one I would say it really depends on the local government on how interested they are in really giving up power, if they really want to cash that check they put out there. So if they build this in and committing to multiple cycles of PB, absolutely, people start going like, why do we have so little money? Why about this? Like, and you can start to get people really knowledgeable about what the budget looks like and the real limitations, and it can lead to that. But once again, this is about designing it with that in mind. If that's the entry point on why people want PB to happen, then we build a process based on that, and that stuff would come up with the steering committee and building those long-term relationships with the government officials who have that power to respond and make those systemic changes to make it more representative.
Great, thanks. Looks like we got maybe one more question and from Brandon, and talking about what are some case examples of smaller scale PB processes, one that might not be in a metro area, but is focused on smaller. Brandon mentioned that he's from a community of 8,000 or less. So are there examples of small scale PB processes happening in schools?
Yeah, that one I'm not as fresh on. I definitely know that there's rural PB in smaller spaces, and all of the ideology and all the things that I'm talking about, actually small scale, it makes it even easier. And thinking about school-based PB, I mean, you're working with, some examples are a group of 100 students. So the smaller is actually much easier to implement because engagement is the most intensive part from kind of like a practitioner point of view. Like, how do I build a process that people show up to, particularly people who have earned mistrust of the government. So those smaller is much easier. And I could, if you're really interested, I can look up some of the smaller ones to give you examples of the case studies of that. The other end is the challenge that people often always like, how does this scale? What does this look like on a state or a federal level? And that is actually some of the more challenging, is how to get it bigger and still meaningful. And because it is it's intensive, and that is something we don't really like apologize for. It's like, yeah, the work of governing is like a full contact sport. So let's get in there, and people really have so much passion about where they live. So let's give them opportunities for more intensive engagement than just simply voting yes or no on something.
Amanda, could I follow up with that question?
Sure.
So I too am an elected official for where I live, and the problem that we actually have is getting more participation, regardless. And so as you say, the organization for PB Oregon is that it doesn't also just represent the Portland metro area. The vast majority of folks actually live outside of the Portland and metro area that make the community of Oregon, right? And so I think that being able to set these seeds for smaller communities to show to the larger communities that it can be successful would be a very great opportunity to have this adopted, across the board within our state for each of the municipalities. But again, I feel like our biggest issue is that we cannot get folks to even, participate on our committees, or that we have outreach. It seems like it's very much the American culture of voting is that we have a republic. I put you in this position by voting for you. to do that work for me, and I don't have to do it myself. So
Mhm.
yeah, I would just say, you know, the P in PB, I think, is such a major component of making success. But
Mhm.
I want to also just say thank you to Tyler and yourself for the work and the presentation today. But I'll take any response on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely, and that was something, what I'm talking about today is the Portland Metro region for sure. We did have in our founding talked really deeply about being an Oregon-wide. A lot of our advocacy is just because most of us are based in the region, but we do have some conversations we've been trying to push in Rogue Valley. And a lot of times because this is about local leadership, I do definitely have less to point to in our work in the different throughout the state, but that is our long-term goal is the entire state of Oregon. I'll definitely look up some local examples, and I want to echo what you're saying there with like, yeah, even the big cities have problems getting people on committees. They might have more people, but if it's really like representative, people who you know want to hit the voices you haven't heard, that's the same challenge. And our position is, I'll be candid, I think it's because committees and all that, they suck. They're not fun. They're inaccessible. Sometimes I feel like my mom might think of me as a fancy person. I don't think of myself as that, but like I on paper should feel totally comfortable in these spaces, and I'm having like heart palpitations walking into them because they're formal and they're weird and they're, you know, you feel like you have to perform. So what I love about PB and when it's done well is that you can be a human and you don't have to have this like really like testifying is nerve-wracking. So the current forms of participation we have are limited, and I would say that was designed on purpose because of how our republic was designed. My favorite thing is to pull up old founding father quotes about how they hated democracy. So we're actually in a moment of a movement of really cashing that check on this is democracy, and it's messy, and we need people to show up, and that means we have so much to repair and so many wrongs we need to fix, but we need to just redesign this according and centered on human need, and that means it's not going to look like committees. It might touch some. I'm not going to ban all committees, but in my new world, I'm creating my head. But definitely, we need full and immersive and all different ways to participate, and that means we just have to build new systems and invest and play that long-term game of relationship building and trust and these kind of things that we need to put humanity back into government. Maybe I don't think it was ever in there. So.
So I think that's it.
Nice. Yes, thanks all for listening to my rant. Thanks for those questions. Those are just some of my favorite things to talk about. Any of our, I just want to go to our think screen here. Anything I've said today, if you think of it later, feel free to email us. We love to talk about this. Our work is really about doing the work of building relationships, and we really want to do this right. Just having PB happen in our community is not enough for us. Having it happen and be a long-term systemic change. Our goal is we want Oregon to really be a multicultural, multiracial democracy that's really about people knowing their power. That's many like deeply felt conversations have gotten us to our vision, and we believe in this stuff. So if you want to talk to us and ask any more questions, throw any critiques our way, we love it all. If you want to get involved with us, we'll send a follow-up email just on some of these easy things we talked about of, you know, who we are and we have some dates on some upcoming testimony spaces if you're interested in getting involved in Gresham. And we have a newsletter, so if you want to join us that way as well, we'd love to connect you to all that's going on. I just want to thank Ty for helping me out today, and thank all of you beautiful people for showing up and doing a webinar, which I often will register for webinars and not show up. So thanks for being a better person than me. And I look forward to getting to know you guys all and learning more about how you could see this in your work and how we could support you and build relationships to trying to transform our democracy.